Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the February Savannah Council on World Affairs program. First, I'd like to, obviously you all found it here, Benedictine, a new venue for us, and we are very appreciative to Father Frank Zimkevich. Where's Father Frank? He's right. Father, thank you. And his staff, they hosted us for lunch today, gave us a tour. Wow, what a place, what a campus. Great school. I'd like to start, as usual, with thanking our sponsors. First is Kreitz Auto Group, which has been striving for over 80 years to provide quality automotive support for those of us in the Brunswick, Savannah, and the Coastal Empire. And secondly, for the Current. And I just want to check my notes to make sure I got it right. So the Current is an inclusive, nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization providing watchdog journalism for Savannah, Brunswick, and the Coastal Empire and coastal Georgia communities. Let me phrase it that way. So we have three of the key folks there, the editor-in-chief, and I'm looking for Margaret Coker. Oh, did she? And then Shannon? Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And then Susan Catron, and I'm sure I'm looking right at Susan, but everybody met, oh, there she is waving in the back. She is the managing editor of the Current. I receive it every day. I read it every day. It is so incisive and to the point. It's really a great read. So thank you both to Kreitz as well as to the Current. Thank you. To get to it, our program this evening is provided by the World Affairs Council of America, which provided or enabled us, I should say, to receive a grant from the Korea Economic Institute. And our panel this evening, pardon my back, our panel this evening is going to be led by our moderator. You recognize retired Ambassador Larry Silverman, and he will introduce our three panelists. So we're going to go for half an hour to 45 minutes and then open it up for questions after that. We have been so far, we've been to Savannah Country Day, we've been to Benedictine, we've been to Georgia Southern. Okay, so this is their fourth panel in about a day and a half. So. They're all? Yeah. Okay. Larry, let me hand it to you.
Jim, thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. Again, thank you, Father, for letting us use this great facility at Benedictine. It was fun to be with the students. I hope they got a lot out of it, too. This is not, ladies and gentlemen, I think you're fortunate. I consider myself fortunate. The timing of this subject, of having this delegation here today is really fortuitous because I think at the council we want to talk about issues that you're interested in and hopefully about issues that are hitting the news at the same time. First of all, of course, you all know about, and it's kind of indicative of the very close, mutually beneficial relationship that the United States and the Republic of Korea have are these new investments that South Korean firms, led by Hyundai, but involving several others, that will bring quality jobs to Georgia, obviously, and help put Georgia further on the economic map. But so there's this big electric car facility that Hyundai will be doing. But I was looking. That's in Bryan County, and then I'm looking at, the different businesses. This is a big business that is fed by many other businesses, of course, suppliers. And as formerly, we have a former person from Toyota here, and they know about the supply chain and all the companies that go into a final vehicle construction plant. So there are going to be facilities in Roswell, in Commerce, in Cartersville, in Gwinnett, and elsewhere in Chatham County, in Bullock County as well, from anything from IT, information technology for cars to plastics and all different kinds of things. So that's one reason why Korea is important to Georgia, and I hope Georgia is important to Korea. And then the other reason is literally in the news as we speak, which is starting last Saturday, unfortunately. There was a North Korean launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile last Saturday, followed on Tuesday, I believe, by their launching of short-range ballistic missiles. And this is all part, of course, or potentially part of a military nuclear capability that we're so concerned about with respect to North Korea. And so our government, the Korean government, and the Japanese government have been busy doing, yesterday they were doing naval missile defense exercises involving naval ships, of course, but also nuclear aircraft and other fighter aircraft. So this is very much in the news. I want to introduce our guest now, starting to my left with Ms. Jung Sung, who is the first secretary, currently the first secretary for economic affairs at the Korean Embassy in Washington. She previously served in her ministry in Seoul and also in Cairo, Egypt. And then to her left, Dr. Mora Bangboy, who is a scientist. Now I get this right. Cardiac biophysicist. Don't ask me to tell you what she does. But we're very fortunate now. I'm saying that we, as a former State Department employee, Dr. Mora is a fellow of the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences, a great organization in Washington, and she's with the State Department for 2 years and maybe, hopefully, more. She is working on the Korea and Mongolia desk. And to my right is Dr. Clint Work, who is a fellow and director of academic affairs at the Korea Economic Institute, from which this grant comes for this event. And that is a think tank kind of in Washington that educates Americans about the Korean Peninsula and about U.S. and the value, particularly the value of U.S.-Korean relations. He comes from both the academic and the think tank areas in Washington, so we have kind of a variety of perspectives. And just before I ask the first question of the panel, I just wanted to say that this is a relationship, and we'll get into it more, which, as you know, started during the Korean War, the hostilities of 1950 to 53, but in part because of Korea's democratization and great economic growth, has blossomed into something that probably nobody ever thought would. And when I look at how broad the relationship is between the United States and South Korea, it's really almost, I would say, a model for what U.S. relations can be with its good partners, because we're so far beyond security and military relations, obviously, and the mutual commitment to the defense of Korea, for example, obviously at the heart of the relationship. But this is now so broad that I would argue that perhaps one of the biggest areas we're going to be involved in is supply chain security, which is so important now. And all kinds of technology, along with the cultural relations, along with our joint efforts to have productive relations in the Indo-Pacific region, to help with energy markets, to help with the movement toward more renewable energy. So there's really pretty much nothing that the United States and South Korea will be working on in the coming decades, again, to the great benefit of our two countries. And I will just quote, I listened to a conference that was going on in Washington this morning, and it included remarks by the South Korean Foreign Minister, Minister Park, and he said, so we, meaning the United States and South Korea, are now great partners in dealing with the era of polycrises. So we're talking about pandemics, and we're talking about climate change. We're talking about direct threats, let's say, from North Korea. We're dealing with the challenges and competition from from China. In ways, we're also dealing with the Ukraine crisis, both of us, in different ways, and our guests will get to that. So very, very broad relationship, and we can talk all about it and get your questions. Last May, President Biden went to Seoul, and he and President Yoon gave issued a statement, of course, after the summit, and a very long list of all these areas and more, artificial intelligence, you name it, that we're involved in. So that's the formal part of the relationship. The two presidents get together. They tell you what we all want to do, but now it's up to people like Young and Mora to help with the implementation of all of these promises about how we can cooperate. And that includes healthcare, by the way, for example. So let me start with a question to Young, which is, from your perspective, from the South Korean perspective, what can we expect over the coming year in terms of actual implementation of this very, very varied and productive relationship? And I have to apologize, we're going to have to pass this microphone back and forth so that we all can be heard.
Hi, I am Young Song from the Korean Embassy, as introduced by Ambassador. Last year in May, two presidents had a meeting in Seoul, and they, of course, they announced a joint statement. And in that joint statement, we clearly defined our relationship as a global comprehensive strategic alliance. There you see the comprehensive word, which means almost covering everything. So two countries are cooperating in, bilaterally in economic security issues, also in combating climate change crisis, and also some kind of delivering our vaccine to the people. And as Ambassador Silverman just mentioned, we can spend hours or days to list up all the cooperations we are dealing together. So let me just give some example how we are implementing the agreed the documents made by two presidents. So this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korea-US alliance. So we started our alliance in 1953, and now it becomes the 70th anniversary this year. So we are planning to do as many things as possible this year, and say for next month we're gonna do these. United States and Korea and two other countries will co-host the Summit for Democracy based on our shared values between two countries. And also there will be a major economic forums regarding the climate change and environment. And also Korea will be part of the conversation. And currently we are also we are also cooperating in dealing with the Ukraine crisis. Even though I am in the economic section inside our embassy, I also covers the development assistance or humanitarian assistance issue. So I have a daily conversation with the USAID, and I deliver those conversation with my counterparts to Seoul to discuss how we can more coordinate in giving an aid to the Ukraine. More specifically, we are currently talking about how we can do more better in the agricultural sector. Say, there are farmers suffering from this war waged by Russia to the Ukraine. So farmers are experiencing a lack of fertilizers or seed. So Korean government can take part in financing the U.S. government's buying those seeds and fertilizers, and then we can provide all those stuffs to the Ukraine people. So that's how we are working together. So I think I will spend a lot of time explaining about how we are working well together.
I will just say that South Korea has also, over the decades, become a large producer of weapon systems and ammunition. Currently, the the United States is buying ammunition from South Korea, some of which then goes to Ukraine to keep up the supply of ammunition to Ukraine. And by the way, Ukraine is helping. Jacek, you'll be happy to hear this. Ukraine is selling various systems to Poland to help Poland defend itself. Hopefully, not needed, but in the meantime, to further westernize Polish military supplies. Let me turn to Maura for the U.S. perspective on implementing, or from the American side, what we can expect in the coming months to a year as they implement this very varied vision, let's say, of U.S.-Korean relations.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having us. I'm so honored that so many people are here to listen to us. This is really mind-blowing. I think, as Young said, we could spend all night talking about implementing this leader statement. I think from the U.S. side, and as someone that works on these issues, I'm happy to say we're doing really well. I think the Hyundai plant coming here is definitely an offshoot of this statement. Our president's made promises. We're going to cooperate economically, and then Korean companies have invested in the U.S., not just in Georgia. I think SK has investments, right? And I think maybe Samsung. So we've economically, we're actually doing well. When it comes to science and technology, we have great cooperation. We have great cooperation on space. NASA's programs, Korea is contributing to them. And when it comes to climate, we really, I think one of the things I've learned being in this relationship or working on this relationship is that we need our allies to actually reach our national goals. And so when we have a goal for greening our energy or zero emissions, we need partners like Korea that has strengths in making electric vehicle batteries or electric vehicles, because they will produce them for our population so that we can take away fossil-fueled cars from the road. And so I think when it comes to the president's statements, I think we've done a really good job. I think we're in a good place. But I think the United States and the Republic of Korea are very proud of what we've done to implement those statements so far. Thank you.
Clint, can I ask you to maybe provide the audience here some maybe perspective, including historical perspective, on the relationship between the United States and South Korea? Clint's been following this for a long time, and to give you a little sense of this transition from what was strictly a security relationship to something much broader.
Sure, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? No? Okay. Okay, I'll do my best to... Okay, it's a fine balance. I sort of stand very humbled, a cardio-biophysicist turned diplomat and an accomplished diplomat in the South Korean Foreign Service, and I'm a disaffected academic turned policy wonk. So, but I am a student of this alliance and its history. And so forgive me if this is a history some of you are familiar with. I've been giving it to some students in the last few days who I'm fairly confident are not familiar with the history. But I think it's good context. So one thing I like to do is do research about the area I'm going to, in this case Savannah in Georgia, and see its connections to the Korean Peninsula. And so during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, 757 Georgians were either wounded or lost their lives in the Korean War. And of course, thousands of others participated in the war. And this included primarily the 3rd Infantry Division, currently stationed at Fort Stewart, at that time Fort Benning, which was in the fight, in the battle during the Korean War for most of it. And of course, since 1953, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Americans, maybe even millions, I should know this number actually, I'm kind of ashamed I don't, have served there over the decades. And to this day, the U.S. maintains roughly 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula, which is not an insignificant number. And when you look at South Korea's history, from its establishment in 1948 to the present day, there was only 1 year in that history when there was not a U.S. military combat presence on the Korean Peninsula. And that was from June of 1949 until June of 1950 when the Korean War broke out. So it's been there all along, and the only time when there wasn't a U.S. force presence, South Korea was nearly destroyed and swallowed whole by external invasion. So it's a long-standing fixture in the security architecture of the Korean Peninsula, which is one of the reasons it's such a sticky, difficult to deal with security environment. Of course, after the war, South Korea was decimated. The entire peninsula was, north and south. And South Korea was an aid recipient, an aid-dependent country for quite some time, for decades. But over those decades, it did what very few other countries have done, which is it industrialized quite literally in a generation's time. I mean, overnight, in world historical time, they industrialized. So as a result of that, they went from being an aid recipient to an aid-donating country. They're heavily involved, not just, as Ji-young said, with Ukraine, but throughout the world, providing assistance of all different sorts. Also, over that 70-year history, they went from being a severe anti-communist dictatorship, deeply allied with the U.S., and transformed into a pretty consolidated, if highly contested, democracy. So over this time, these deep military and security ties, which remain to this day, codified in a mutual defense treaty, had layered on top of them deeper economic linkages, and of course this links to the state of Georgia, and also shared democratic values. But to this day, the state of Georgia still, I mean, just yesterday, South Korean and U.S. defense officials visited Kings Bay Naval Base, sub base, which is the East Coast station of our Trident subs, which are the highest level of our defense commitment in terms of extended deterrence to not just South Korea, but to all our allies. God forbid they would ever have to be used. So it's dynamic, it's complex, it's effervescent, and I've been long-winded, so I'll pass the mic back.
Thank you, Clint. Any relationship that the United States has with other countries is not always, doesn't mean perfect accordance between the United States and its friends, and it's the same case for the United States and South Korea. So we're all talking about the wonderful cooperation that we can do, the complementarity that we have around the world. But we disagree on certain things. But we disagree respectfully and transparently as partners. So to give one example from either side, you know that the United States has export controls on technology going to China as part of our larger effort to compete with China. Well, that includes semiconductors. But South Korea and South Korean companies are major suppliers of semiconductors to China. And they are not stopping that. And that is in the Republic of Korea's economic interest to do that. It's logical. On the other side of the equation, you are all familiar, I think, with the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year and became law, part of which subsidizes, by which the U.S. government subsidizes U.S. companies, U.S. industry, to help with the movement towards renewable energy, including electric vehicles, that gives particular subsidies for the sale of U.S.-made electric vehicles to the American companies, and not only South Korean companies, but the European states and companies have complained and said, but that's squeezing us out of the market, or at least unfairly allowing the American companies to unfairly compete because they are subsidized. As you all know, we all talk about free trade, but we often don't do free trade, and every country has its own reasons for wanting to either to protect its industries. So the South Koreans are not happy with that, and then we have to deal with both sides of that in the relationship. So, Young, let me turn to you for the South Korean perspective on how two friends deal with issues on which they don't agree while maintaining that very strong basis of international cooperation.
Yeah, we sometimes do disagree on certain aspects, but we are allies, so we frequently have a dialogue with each other, like as a government-to-government level, regardless of which level it is, from high level to the working level officers. We have a continuous dialogue with each other, and we're trying to, the law is already there. And if we cannot fix it or make an amendment of the law, we need to find a solution anyhow to better utilize this law, which is already passed. So our government and the U.S. government, we had a continuous talk, especially between our ministry, not only between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Department of State of the United States, but also with the Department of Treasury and Department of Commerce and their counterparts from the Korean side. We try to, we know the aim of this act. It's which is to deal with the climate crisis, as well as to facilitate the energy transition, and they also wanted to boost the American middle class citizens. So we understand the aim of the Biden administrations to pursue this act, and as an embassy official, we try to translate that law into to Korean language, and we try to let Korean people to better understand law and to utilize this law, because we do have a vehicle industry in Korea, but also we have a battery industry and other industries that can be benefited by this law. So we are trying to maximize the latter part rather than focusing on the differences we have. Yeah.
Can you hear me? I'm going to try to keep this close to my mouth. I think what Young said is very important. I think the benefit of having an ally is that you're able to speak to each other very bluntly. And so when the act passed, we definitely heard from the Republic of Korea. We definitely heard, we're not happy with you. You're hurting us. We heard that loud and clear multiple times at multiple levels. And I think that's the benefit, is that your allies will tell you in truth how they feel. But the other thing, as Young said, she said, well, we understand the intent of the law. And I think that's important, because as U.S. government, we're able to say to Korea, well, this is the intent of this law. If you look a bit closer, maybe you will benefit from it. And then they're able to say, yes, maybe we'll benefit, but there are parts that hurt us, and we're able to have a conversation and try to solve the problem together. And I think that's a great thing about working with allies. The other thing I like to say about the sticky portions of a relationship with allies is that many times when you talk to allies and you solve a problem together, people think you're making concessions. The truth is that working with your allies is also in our national interest. There's no point in having an ally that is weakened, right? We don't want, and so when we talk about the relationship between Korea and China, and we talk about some of the acts we are passing to protect ourselves and compete favorably, the goal is not to have Korea decouple from China. The goal is not to hurt Korea economically, because if we do that, then we have a weak ally that cannot help us in the things we want to do in other parts of the world. And so the goal is to talk to Korea and find a way forward to diversify our supply chains and make sure that we're all protected in a world where many times there's a monopoly on certain things. And so I think working through these issues with our allies is not a concession. It's actually in both our national interest to have allies that are strong and that can work together towards a common goal.
Thank you, Maura. I think if you look at the history of when the United States and its allies have had disagreements on areas, including this economic area, area, I tend to look further down the road. So we will have this disagreement, and then we are already, I bet, starting to plan for 10 years down the road. I think in general, maybe we'll have more cooperation between U.S. and South Korean companies. So if they're in joint operations, then they can benefit from any kind of incentive program. That's often what happens. It's the if you can't beat them, join them strategy, and it works both ways. South Korean companies seeking out American partners and American companies seeking out South Korean partners in particular areas, whether it's artificial intelligence. Cybersecurity is a huge potential area for further cooperation. And one other area, as we mentioned, the supply chain. You know the expression, onshoring, to bring things that we used to buy, for example, from China, just like things that Europe used to buy from Russia, oil and gas. They seek out other partners. In terms of securing the supply chain, what you're trying to do is to bring more of that production of the things that you need back home. The problem with that is it can be expensive. There is a reason why we buy from overseas. Usually it's cheaper. So you're bringing more of it home, but that's onshoring. What we can do with countries, good partners like Korea, is something you may have heard the term or not. You'll be hearing a lot more about it in coming years, which is nearshoring or friendshoring. So you're still willing to buy from an overseas supplier, but that supplier is a very reliable ally. Not, for example, somebody like Mr. Putin who will threaten to cut you off at some point, as he's done with oil and gas. So I think in some ways it will lead to a change over time in the commercial and economic relationship. We started off talking about North Korea and the threat that North Korea poses, and in a particularly down period right now in North Korean behavior because of the missile test, which the North Korean regime itself has said is not entirely a test when it comes to South Korea. It's a threat against South Korea. So let me ask Clint to give us a little bit of a crystal ball about what we can expect from North Korea in the coming years. I personally am quite pessimistic about what we can expect. Both when President Yoon and President Biden got together last May, they reiterated that they're ready for a dialogue with North Korea. That is obviously not being reciprocated. The only thing that's happening are these tests. But what do you see in the coming year, Clint?
Yeah, I'm much more comfortable retreating to history than I am trying to predict the future, especially when it comes to a state like North Korea, whose the most predictable thing about them is their unpredictability. But there are certain patterns in that when you trace it over time. But to answer the question specifically, I too am pessimistic about the current year. It may not have been on the front pages because of Ukraine and worsening U.S.-China relations and balloons. But North Korea tested more ballistic missiles last year than they have in any calendar year in their country's history. They've also passed a nuclear policy law and doctrine that is both more forceful and offensive in terms of their declaratory policy on nuclear weapons, but also more ambiguous. It's like both precise and ambiguous at the same time, which indicates they would potentially use them first. Of course, the U.S. itself does not have a no first use policy as well. In some ways, they're trying to play the same large power game with their doctrine as we do ours, even though they're clearly not a great power. But what they've really done in developing their missile capabilities is they've developed really a full suite of capabilities, from short-range ballistic missiles and long-standing artillery amassed along the DMZ to all the way up to ICBMs, which in theory can reach the entirety of the continental United States. There are still questions about whether or not they have the capability to miniaturize and mate a warhead to an ICBM and that those ICBMs have the re-entry capabilities to make the flight. But for all intents and purposes, military planners, operationally speaking, have to assume they do. And so what does this do? It's always been an extended deterrence commitment that the U.S. has made to South Korea, which is to say, coming to their defense over there. The fact that North Korea now has, at least in theory, the ability to touch, which is a very inartful term when we're talking about ICBMs that are nuclear tipped, the continental United States, it raises severe questions and doubts for some people in South Korea, understandably, about would Washington trade Seattle to save Seoul, right? And the same questions occurred during the Cold War. Would we risk New York to save Paris, or DC to save Berlin? And this has also resulted in increased calls among some in South Korea for them to develop their own nuclear weapons. So in this context, the U.S. and South Korea as an alliance have really ramped up their military exercises, their tabletop exercises, visits, like I mentioned, to Kings Bay, both to reassure South Korea that the U.S. is, in fact, credible in its commitment to their defense, but also to signal to North Korea that we're prepared, that we're making the preparations we need to, of course, deter them. However, there is a lot more discussion on both sides of the DMZ these days about potential need for preemptive strikes. So the rhetoric is ratcheted up. Both countries have instituted new language in their essentially public-facing language that North Korea is South Korea's main enemy, which is something that had not been in their defense white papers for the last several years while diplomacy was underway. And North Korea has followed suit, calling South Korea its undoubted enemy. So a lot of invective and a lot of testing and a lot of discussion of preemption rather than de-escalation. So I do worry that accidental escalation or miscalculation and sort of shorter decision-making windows, or the perception of shorter decision-making windows, could lead to a lower level provocations, which there have been many of over the years on the Korean Peninsula, leading to something potentially worse. I hope I'm wrong. I'm not predicting war, because I do think Kim Jong-un and the regime is more interested than anything else in their own self-preservation, and they know to start a war or to escalate to a war is going to bring that to a very quick end. So hopefully that overwhelming reality settles nerves on all sides. So I hope my pessimism is not proven right.
I think it's realism. Before we go to your questions, I wanted to ask one last question of Young. You've been reading all about, with respect to Ukraine, about the coalition that's been built to deal with the Ukraine conflict, so that people are sharing this burden that we have in helping defend, or helping the Ukrainians defend themselves. Well, we have a parallel, of course, coalition building in the Indo-Pacific, and with the United States, it's come through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which South Korea has joined. We may explain it in different terms. We may talk about the United States. We may talk more about putting it in the context of competition with China. South Korea will not put it in that same kind of context for obvious reasons, but it is developing its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which complements, again, I think, ours. It includes it was just published in December, I think, and this past December, and it includes deepening, let's say, cooperation with its allies in the region, which include Japan, which has not always been the case. For example, anti-submarine exercises that South Korea does with Japan, which had been suspended or had not been happening for several years. So, Young, could you tell us a little bit more about what this, what the intent of this strategy is, and what are South Korea's priorities for beefing up, let's say, this broader partnership in the region?
Yeah, we call this strategy as an Indo-Pacific strategy by the Korean government. Its basic idea is to strengthen our relations with the Indo-Pacific countries, which includes ASEAN countries, with Southeast Asian countries, also with the Pacific Island countries. So we are trying to contribute to the international world based on the norm and international rule-based order. So, as Korea has become we had a fast economic growing in our history, and at the same time we achieved to become a mature democratic countries. So we have a strength in sharing our experience of the development and achieving the democracy. So and especially in the Pacific area is the area, Korea is located in the Pacific region. So we are trying to start from there and try to expand our diplomatic relations more with the broader range of our neighbors. So we did have tried a lot to build better relations with those countries, but with this Indo-Pacific strategy, we will try to build the relations more based on the rule and the order, international order, and and we will put more emphasis on the values. So in coming May, we invited leaders from the Pacific Islands. So we are having a summit meeting in Korea. And this can be, I think, a good opportunity to show how Korea is planning to strengthen our relations with those regions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Young. We're going to open it up for your questions, and if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to you. We'll start there in the back, and so we can use the microphone. Then I will walk back and give the microphone. So sorry for that, but I think it'll help everybody hear better. So we have a question here in the back.
Less a question than just more of a comment. I was the former deputy commander of the 501st MI Brigade in Korea, the intelligence brigade to the United States Forces Korea. I'm less concerned. I agree with you, there's cause for concern. I am less concerned about him actually coming across the border, other than a minor incursion just to cause an overreaction, than I am about other things going on at the border. For instance, I wonder where he's getting all the butadiene and isocyanate for our scientists right there to produce those new solid fuel rocket missiles. Those should be controlled items if the U.S. government does not already control those, because butadiene is not something that they can naturally produce in North Korea. I worry about when OPCON transfer is going to be complete, so that we have complete control of the U.S. forces as well as Korean forces under Korean command, rather than just U.S. forces Korea. And I just want to point out that in Korea we have one of the, you talk about being allies, we are much closer than allies. The 2nd Infantry Division is the only division in the United States Army that has a deputy commander that is a Korean general, and it's called a combined division. Combined meaning multinational division. So that's the only one in the United States Army. It's truly impressive. The Korean government has put soldiers into our elements. We call them Katusas, who work directly with us. Truly an amazing force multiplier. It's an amazing government, and as I told you earlier tonight, in September, I'm going to be bringing a Korean grandchild will be coming into the world, so I'm truly happy about that. You have a phrase that we use often in the military over there, and you probably know it well. 같이 we go together. I prefer the phrase 우리가 남입니까? It's more of a provincial saying, but it means are we not family? But if I could ask just one question, I'd like you to spend just a moment to talk about the Korean Health Service and how you have national health and how it works over there, because frankly, I got some of the best surgery at Severance Hospital I've ever had in my life.
Thank you. You want to say something about the health service?
you want to start?
I'm going to follow up with you individually because OpCon transfer, I'm biased, but I think I wrote the best report on that. And so I want to share it with you and see what you think. And I'm charting this very actively. But that's really in the weeds. So, it is a single-payer healthcare system. So essentially a national healthcare system. I was playing hoops on Yongsan Army Garrison, and an infantryman much bigger than me didn't want me to make my reverse layup or was just playing vigorous defense. And he knocked me out in the midair, and I crashed down. I fractured both my elbows at the same time. Yeah, it was nasty. I thought I was going to have to come home to the States, and I was teaching English in South Korea at the time. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to go $80,000 in debt. I'm going to blow through my savings. But I thought, well, why am I going to do that? I've got 50% coverage under their healthcare plan through my E2 visa, and I'll go to the local hospital, and my surgeon, though he said he didn't speak good English, he spoke very good English. Invasive surgery on both. I still have either 2 here or 3 here. 2 screws here, 3 screws here. I'll have them for the rest of my life. Full hospital stay, CAT scans, all the above. And I think it cost me a total of like $4,200. And that was with 50% coverage. If I had full coverage, it would have been much cheaper. And I've recovered fully. You'll all be glad to know, I'm sure. But I would say that there are issues with their single health payer system because of the shrinking population and the world's lowest birth rates. And so what's happening, many things are happening as a result of that. The country's aging and the population shrinking, and pediatric units are closing. So there are less pediatricians, which means their level of pay, based on how the payment structure is in a single-payer system, is like a quarter of what it used to be 15 years ago. So it's actually quite a crisis. So there's good and bad. But anyway, Ji-young.
Yeah, for the healthcare system, before I came abroad, I took it for granted for the healthcare system I was enjoying in Korea. Now I see it wasn't like it is not happening all around the world. I'm learning. I'm trying to learn what's the difference between our system and the U.S. system and what makes the difference. But we do pay, like a tax, we do pay for the healthcare, and then everybody is getting benefit from this system. So, and also governments, government take burdens a lot in order to sustain this system. But as Clint just mentioned, extremely low birth rate is becoming a social problem these days. And younger generation, they feel like in order to sustain this healthcare system and also the pension system, younger generation have to pay more taxes, and it's getting a social resistance from the generation. Why should we pay for the older generation? So it becomes a conflict between the generations. So, yeah.
I think the birth rate is down to 0.78 now, in 0.78. Yes.
Hi. That was a great discussion. Can everybody hear me? I have a very simple question. You talked about the Korean economic miracle, and I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the role of culture in that development. The role of culture. How did Korea develop, whereas so many other countries with similar sorts of demographics and natural resource endowment, et cetera, et cetera? Well, how did Korea do that?
That's frequently asked questions from many different other countries when we travel and when we speak the same thing. We cannot point out one single reason that we were able to make success, I would say. But today I want to mention about the U.S. The effect of the U.S. aid at that time. Of course, it was during the Cold War, and the world was divided into two parts. So, Korea was a some kind of symbol to the U.S. aid at that time. So U.S. had granted a lot of money in order for Korea to successfully make our own development. So I think, but nowadays, people, many countries do give some development assistance to single country, but not the amount of money itself is not enough compared to those that was given to the Korea right after the war. And that is another reason. But Korean people like to say that it's due to the diligence of the Korean people. And of course, Korean people had a eagerness in our heart that we need to be better. You know, we had almost 30 years of colonization period under Japan. And Korean people had some kind of feeling that we need to do better. We were not like this before. We can do better. So everybody was so eager to educate their children. And this educational fever continues until now. And sometimes it's referred to be a problem. So too much night study time. But yeah.
Thank you. I'll go back here.
So I have two questions. One is for Clint and one is for Young. First, Clint, is what, in light of the irrational and dangerous behavior of North Korea, clearly irrational at times and dangerous, how much of that behavior is influenced real time by China in real time? How much of those decisions to launch, not launch, how much of that is happening not because of Kim Jong-un but because of Xi Jinping? And the other question is what in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy, how does that relate to the Quad strategy that the U.S. has put in place?
Thank you. We'll go to Clint first.
The first thing I'll say is I wouldn't call Kim Jong-un irrational. I'd actually say he's hyper-rational and incredibly calculating and shrewd because of how profoundly constrained their situation is and because of how imperative his own survival is in this constrained environment. They really have to calculate hard about what is and is not possible. It's a monstrous regime that treats its people like, psychopathically and so I wouldn't call him crazy, or you didn't say that, or irrational. But so this is an interesting question, and of course I would be irresponsible if I didn't preface it by saying I don't know for sure. But China is, as I see it, and others see it too, it's sort of a not background, but sort of larger structural constrainer or enabler. So when it comes to real-time effect on to launch or not to launch, I don't think the Chinese government has much, if any, influence on those decisions. I think they may have some influence on the degree to which North Korea does or doesn't conduct their nuclear tests, but even that I think may be limited. I think China's in a situation like the U.S. has been with some allies where they can have overwhelming influence, but it's like to use it would be. They could crush North Korea's economy instantly if they wanted to, but that's not in their interest to do that. So in the current environment we're in, I think actually China has, they've created, along with Russia, a more permissive environment just in terms of international institutions and the UN Security Council specifically. They have blocked any efforts at imposing new sanctions, blocked any efforts at even passing UN Security Council presidential statements condemning North Korea for its behavior. So I think they're, I don't want to say giving them a leash, long or short, because I don't think it's that much. They have leverage but not control. I would just say I think China's order of preferences for the Korean Peninsula, for North Korea specifically, is, in ascending order of importance: no nukes, no instability, no war. So they're willing to, accept nukes, before they are instability, and instability before they are war. So, they'd rather they didn't have these things, but they do, and there is a buffer role that North Korea does play. There's a lot more, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Clint. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Quad term, that's Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. Would we mind if Korea joined? No, we wouldn't. China has different thoughts about that, but that does not mean that South Korea cannot cooperate with elements of what we talk about in the Quad. But I'll let Young comment further.
It may have some similarities between two form of cooperation, but Indo-Pacific strategy does not intend to antagonize certain country or certain region, but we try to make more comprehensive, and like our pursuit of doing this strategy is to make a peace and prosperity over the region. And as I just mentioned, the Indo-Pacific region is one of the nearest area where Korea is being part of. So it's fact that Korea is located in between like China, Japan, and Russia. Like they're big countries. So we do have to survive, and we do have to make a good relations with our neighbors. So we do not make our strategy that can be some. I'm not necessarily saying that Quad is something like that, but for our perspective, Indo-Pacific strategy is to make a better way to live all together in a better way. That's.
I hate to do this to you, but I'd like you to put yourself as the head of North Korea. What are you really afraid of? And what is this nuclear posturing buying you?
Good question. You can have your own country. You can snap your fingers and do everything you want.
Great. This is actually a very good question. Maura and I were going for a walk earlier after visiting Chippewa Square because I had to see where Forrest sat. Maura still hasn't seen the movie, which I've been shaming her for. I'm sorry.
Flash news, the bench is gone.
Yeah, the bench is gone. I think Kim Jong-un is more afraid of his own people than he is U.S. military power. I think he also inherited his role, so none of us chooses the conditions into which we're born. So I think if he, before his existence, could have chosen an easier life, he probably would have. This is not to play apologist for the guy. No country that treats its own people that way is a strong, legitimate government. And this is where, and I don't know where this line is, I often question just how bellicose we can be towards North Korea. When I say we, I mean the U.S. and South Korean alliance. I understand it. Preparedness is key. All of that's key. But it's very easy for Kim Jong-un to point to external threats as legitimation for this brutal, inhumane nightmare that he creates at home. I will also say he's used COVID very instrumentally to further crack down. In part, it was because they don't have the public health infrastructure to deal with the pandemic. But it was also a ready excuse to, different analysts have different takes on this, but I think to further reinforce their rule over their population because, people have been forecasting North Korea's demise since the waning days of the Cold War, when they lost their Soviet ally, when the Chinese said, hey, we'll trade with you, but you got to provide actual hard currency. Yet they persist. And the sanctions against them are so punishing. So I think it's internal insecurity leads to external saber rattling. And just to be clear, having nukes, if the U.S. is your archenemy, is more beneficial than not having nukes. Not to say that North Korea has total legitimate claims, but just as a nation state that truly does mistrust the U.S. in its core, going back to the Korean War, having nukes is better than not having them. And so I do think it is the ultimate deterrent. It's the treasured sword of the regime. But I think ultimately it's rooted in internal insecurity because it's not a legitimate regime.
I just wanted. It was a very good question, and I think that one should never forget, never stop realizing that these are people. They are personalities. This is not just about inanimate governments. These are people who think like people and calculate like people. I lived in Syria under the father Hafez al-Assad, and he was dying. And he brought back his son, the current leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, who was studying ophthalmology in the UK, in London, at the time. And I'm pretty sure that Bashar al-Assad didn't have any great desire to be the leader of Syria. Absolutely. Nor would I, for that matter. And for some of the very same reasons about the weakness of the regime because of how it has treated its people over the many decades. Now, unfortunately, he's grown into the job with a sense of brutality that his father had as well. But that's not how he went into it. And I wonder if some of that was there too, whether it's reluctance but these are personal things that leaders adopt, and then maybe you try to be like your father. You try to be. Eventually, you develop your own persona, but there isn't always a master plan behind all of it. Young, do you want to say anything else? No. You had a question, I think. No.
You just haven't mentioned the Philippines or Indonesia in any relationship. Is that because they're just so weak they don't count? I never see them on our news, and I never heard you talk about it.
Lloyd Austin would be disappointed with you. Lloyd Austin, our defense secretary, would be disappointed. We just signed a big base agreement with the Philippines, which is very, very productive. But
that was a funny statement. I think it's funny that you mentioned the Quad Indo-Pacific strategy. The U.S. has its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy closely aligns with ours, and that actually covers Southeast Asia and some relationships with the Philippines and Indonesia. So they're very important countries in that area. They're really very important. We don't think they're weak. We're pursuing. We have a strong relationship with the Philippines. Actually, I think we have military alliances with the Philippines, right? No. Yeah. So these are important countries to us. They're not weak at all, and they're not. For the U.S. government, they're part of our calculus, actually. They're not ignored countries. Oh, yeah.
And especially for Korea, in an effort to diversify our security supply chain, we are closely cooperating with those two countries. And we cannot exclude those two countries when we talk about supply chain issues.
I mean, this is actually a really good point. So the ambassador had mentioned South Korea's own really robust defense industry and defense exports. And so they're currently developing essentially a 4.5 generation fighter jet, the KF-21 or KFX program, the Borame program. And they're doing this. Indonesia they haven't fully paid up, but they are committed to paying 20% of the cost of this development. It's a sort of co-production development of very, very cutting-edge fighter jets, part of which will be constructed in Indonesia and will become part of the Air Force. And so this is actually one way where, in my world's lingo, South Korea is what you'd call a security provider, where it's like the U.S. obviously provides the nuclear umbrella and an alliance with them, but South Korea is bolstering its security relationship with a lot of countries in ways that the U.S. can't really, because our defense exports are too expensive, and we also won't share certain production technologies with certain countries. But South Korea is able to do that and does do that, and they're a deep ally with us. And Indonesia is a key example. So I appreciate you asking that question, because it's not just about the Korean Peninsula.
There was a question over. Excuse me.
With all of the sanctions we read about on North Korea, where do they get their resources, funding, etc.?
Who wants to take it?
I'd like to say something about that. I think as a scientist, one of the exciting things is that what we're learning is that science, the economy, they're all tied into our national security. And so I think one of the things that is well known is that illicit cyber activities generate income that bypass some of the sanctions that we place on certain governments. And so I think that's part of it, is that North Korea definitely has illicit cyber activities that provide income to fund some of its missile production. That's the short answer.
I think he's also doing technology transfer. It's not unsurprising that you will find that Iran has representatives in North Korea every time he does one of those famous missile shots. And so you're seeing illegal arms sales of high technology, nuclear technology being exported around the world by there. And certainly the cyber hacking is a huge issue. They have a portion of their military dedicated to doing nothing but cyber hacking, and they are often the ones who will lock up the computer system and ask you to pay, $1,000, $10,000, $1 million ransoms, and they steal cyber currency across the world, the crypto stuff, which is pretty much untraceable.
And that's why Korea and the U.S. government are strengthening our cooperation regarding the cybersecurity issues.
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? How can they continue to do this when they're so constrained? Just the ballistic missile tests last year, the estimates range that they spent anywhere from $400 million to $650 million just to test all these ballistic missiles. Where in God's name are they coming by this money? Especially when one of their biggest sources of trade with China, they curtailed almost entirely during COVID. It's come back a little bit, but it's still profoundly constrained. So where are they getting these resources? And it's been mentioned, all manner of cyber activities. And the promise of cryptocurrency exchanges is their decentralized, unregulated nature. That's a boon for states like North Korea. It's like a field day. So they have robbed lots of cryptocurrency exchanges. They have difficulty converting that cryptocurrency to hard cash. I think they're doing it to Chinese renminbi is their key way of doing it. And this is one way that they're able to continue to fund what they do. And there's also a lot of sanctions evasion as well that occurs.
Unfortunately, cryptocurrency is a way of avoiding or evading lots of sanctions. We have time for one more question, if we have another question. Anybody else who hasn't asked a question first? Okay.
How is it that South Korea dominates women's golf?
I haven't started golf yet, but we had a nice golfer back in 1997 to 1990. Her name was Seri Park. She excelled in the most of the major tournaments here in the U.S. And she became a good model, and she gave everybody a hope that we can do it together. we can make it again. So many junior golfers are following her steps, and yeah, that's it.
Just one observation. It's one of the reasons why I love my Korean brothers and sisters is when they take to something, watch out. Because they and it just takes one successful example among a Korean and then that example, and then it's incredible. I think it's part of their developmental story too, to be frank. There's a character there. It's incredible.
Great. Thank you. That's those new knees. All right. So, in conclusion, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'd like to, again, just thank our sponsors, Kreitz Auto Group, as well as The Current. Thank you so much. A new sponsor, and the sponsors are very important to us. We cannot do what we do in terms of bringing people down, bringing speakers down, like this panel, or provide travel assistance to college students. So again, thank you to those sponsors. Again, thank you to Father Frank, headmaster of Benedictine. Superb, really. I understand Father baked the cookies himself back there, so I know lying to a priest isn't very smart, is it? And thank you to first to our moderator, Ambassador Larry Silverman, and our three panelists from KEI. Thank you so much. Our next program is the 23rd of March. It will be back at the Savannah Community Church. It'll be at 7:30 p.m. Right now, we don't have a title, but the speaker is retired Army Colonel Jeff McCausland. You might have seen him on television different times. Jeff has proposed many different topics, many of which revolve around Ukraine. And one of his thoughts was, let me talk about Ukraine and possible impacts around the world of what that special operation is all about. And that's it. Thank you all for coming. Be careful going home. Drive safely. See you next month.